Recording in progress.
It is now in progress. And with you know what? Here's the thing. I got to start out with this. Dalin, hi, by the way. Welcome.
Hey!
We are back again covering Anne with an E and talking about some of the different psychological and, just social and other underpinnings that are there. And just because it's a dope show, as you know, if you listen to the other two episodes of Fan with an E is what I call it. Now, how could I have missed this, by the way? It was right there that I could have called this analysis, right? I can't believe I missed that opportunity.
Come on, Dwight.
So we'll have to make that part of the show now as I'm introducing. So we're going to do some analysis on this episode. Maybe it was worse. I'm not sure. But, I've never met a pun that I didn't like, I think. I can't remember one anyway that I did.
I'm of a similar persuasion. Love a good pun.
Well, we were just talking about how we both just rewatched this very recently. We're talking about episode 3, but what is so headstrong as youth? That is the name of this episode. I have an alternate name for it, and then we can launch into wherever we want to. But did you hear that? Okay, great. Had a Bluetooth device just turn off loudly on my desk. Now, I have a dynamic mic, so you may not have heard it, but I thought I'd draw attention to it anyway. It's good podcasting. So this is my thought. As far as the title or the theme of this episode, I thought the thin veneer of civilization. Now, because what is this episode if not people being civilized and good, and then reacting to things that are actually true and good and more, I mean, may not all true or all good, but meant well, and we'll get into that. But the good civilized citizens, those that are, of the acceptable, right? All being real dicks. We peel away that thin veneer and we find out that they suck. I mean, which civilization, societal expectations suck, I think, in real life as well, often. But that's my first thought about this episode. Where are you at first impressions?
So my first impression is that I would call this the Regina George episode. There's a lot of Regina Georges in the world of Anne with an E, but if any episode proves it, this is the one. Because between our group of, I guess you could call it this universe's plastics that go to the school that Anne does, or the feminist group that is as cool. They seem cool at first, but then turns out, spoiler alert, not great.
Yeah, it's real interesting because it reminds me of what I hear from people nowadays, and I'll throw myself out there here. I'm a little on the left wing, if anyone hasn't picked up on that by now, and by listening to the show, maybe hello, welcome to your first episode, I guess is what I should say if you haven't picked up on that. But so I'm pretty far on the liberal side myself. Let me say that.
Same here.
However, the feedback that I've gotten from people whom I would consider myself to be an ally, a supporter, whatever you want to call it, is that they get sick of people, especially people in a position of any kind of privilege, which it was a group of women back at that time, but they were the wealthier or the established women of the town, right? Coming at issues like, oh, well, yeah, we want to help and we have good feelings and good beliefs, but we'll engage on our terms, right? Mm-hmm. It's still seen through their lens of like, it's feminism. Hold on now. I mean, that was my impression of that, as it reminded me of the do-gooder liberal approach that we could easily fall into, which is, yeah, I'll do it, but I'll do it my way. And I have certain rules and boundaries around. I mean, take, for example, how many times do you hear someone say a phrase like, well, hasn't it gone far enough? Don't
Mm-hmm.
they, and I'm going to use they as like any group we want to use. Oh, haven't they, accomplished enough? And, when is it going to be good enough? And stop criticizing the way I do my ally thing. So anyway, there's
Yeah.
a little political stuff right off the bat for everybody.
Yeah, and I totally agree that that's like an aspect of it for sure. And I think also kind of in tandem with that, especially when it comes to the, feminist mom group that Marilla gets involved with in the top of the episode, those characters seem like they're incredibly accepting and, wanting to be the most open-minded possible until they are faced with what is arguably something that to them crosses the line. And yet they cannot see that maybe if they were actually more open-minded, that certain people, maybe you could understand them a little more, like in Anne's case, and not be a jerk about, her upbringing, where she came from, and the circumstances that she couldn't control.
Absolutely. And as we will look into and get into here in a bit, it was true. The things that they're ultimately, and I'm kind of going at this backwards because we'll build up into what she said here, but everything Anne was saying, well, not everything. She was wrong about some details, I guess, of human sexuality. However, teacher be creeping. I mean,
Yeah.
that's true. And people are like, oh, you made her cry. And it's like, well, okay, yeah, I mean, I did, air quotes, I made her cry. You know what I mean? And she doesn't necessarily understand that, but who does the fault? The fault lies with the teacher. And it's like, if you, unfortunately, we see that reflected IRL, which is, sometimes if you're the one talking about something, oh, that's not okay. You hear me? I mean, it's happening, and maybe even we all kind of know it's happening, but you can't talk about it. What are you doing? We don't. That's against the rules, right?
Right. Exactly. And on top of it, the whole concept of May December romances in literature and pop culture media of this kind is something of that time period that was much more romanticized. But I really appreciate that in this show, they talk about relationships like that as being a lot more scandalous, as they should be, than something that's like upheld to something of a, romantic high point peak standard that I think a lot of media of the past did,
And when you look at, interestingly enough, the relationship between Prissy and Mr. Phillips, I wrote that down.
Yes, I believe so. Yeah.
The relationship between, it was also depicted as fairly scandalous in the old and miniseries. Not quite the same as this one, but it was showcased to be like, oh, he's out of here, you lose his job. And, spoilers for down the road here. But, that it was a problem, which is also interesting. So I think he looked a lot older in the old version, though, than this guy does. This is, I guess, supposed to be she's almost on her way out of school and he's a young teacher, whatever. But but yeah, there is that dynamic going on. So I wanted to, before we get into what was said at school, I thought Anne's prep for school was very interesting. A couple elements, right? She wakes up just chatter, 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 saying confident words, right? Like, oh, it's going to be great. Isn't it going to be great? And boy, lifelong friends and all this is going to be great, isn't it? It's going to be great. It's going to be great. There's like, okay, even Marilla, okay, calm down. We all know that you don't really think it's going to be great.
Right, exactly. And I think there's a lot. Yeah, exactly. And I think there's a lot to be said also of how, at least from my perspective as a neurospicy person, I very much relate to Anne in this scene of trying to talk herself up to being social and wanting to make a good impression. And in many ways, wanting to mask, to come across as normal and acceptable. But to her version of normal and acceptable, obviously, as the episode later shows us, is very different than what most people in the community tend to believe.
Yeah, and she feels it. You can feel it's palpable, visceral kind of feeling of she's going to a place where she has no concept of how to fit in, and everybody else there does, right? And even the fact that she decorates her hat on the way to school. She finds wildflowers and is like taking the time to twine or intertwine them into her hat, almost like she's like, I need something, extra, which is part of her personality. I think imagination, decorating making things pretty and beautiful with words or philosophy, those are things that she uses as coping skills, right? So
Right.
she's like, this will help. It doesn't help, as it turns out.
No.
The things that, in fact, all the things she thinks will help seem to not help.
Yeah, they go in the complete opposite direction. And I think that the aspect of her hat definitely is another example of how Anne always goes one extra step too far when it comes to, explaining who she is or showing off the person that she's always wanted society to accept her to be. And I definitely relate to that because I know when I went on my first day of school, whatever grade it was, I always put on the extra coat that I didn't need to or the extra hair clip to make myself more pronounced and, kind of the I'm not like other girls vibe. So I totally get why, she would feel compelled to do that. But I think it's also similarly really interesting the reaction that her friend has when she sees the hat, because it's kind of like her first inkling of like, ooh, I guess I went too far.
And Diana's reactions in here are very interesting, I think, because, a lot of times we'll see throughout this series, and I think this is an update a bit, because I feel like in the old version, it was just Diana was there, except for the brief, the interlude where her parents didn't let her and things. In this version, I think that Diana is actually a little bit more developed. And not just because she's played by the actor who played Agent Olive, I think, in The Odd Squad, but a very, very dynamic role in a kids show, actually. But because she's a little more complex. She's trying to be there for Anne, but she chickens out or some boundary. And I think we see this repeated in several things. I think it's in season 2 we'll get to where, there's even some issues of queer issues and things that come up. And I guess a spoiler, if anyone, I guess, but you'll find that that would just, not a big spoiler, but not everybody back then can go there. Right. And I think Diana is someone who's like, boy, she feels it. She feels an affinity to something to do with Anne and her sense of passion and romance, but she can't quite. Right. I mean, it's kind of like, oh, I'm going to go. How many times in this episode, 2 or 3, does she say, I'm going to go smooth things over with the girls? And it's like, you just don't want the girls to see you hanging out with Anne.
Right.
I mean, not that she does, you know what I mean? Not that she doesn't mean it, but.
Yeah. And I think that that's true to a degree, but I think it's also because she's trying to smooth things over as sort of a way to like hone, Anne back into a sense of heteronormativity, of being more safe for an acceptable kind of, for lack of a better word, conservative palette of that community, to fade more into the background instead of trying to have that main character energy.
Right. So, that's a really good point. So it's not malicious at all. It's not like she's trying to ditch her. And interestingly enough, when you see her family dynamic as one of the wealthier, if not the wealthiest of Avonlea, is that's how she's been treated her whole life. Is like you are being made into someone who is good enough. You will someday be good enough. Anything you want to do that deviates from this course is not good enough, right? And so she's really, in a way, kind of, I don't want to say parenting, but she's befriending Anne in the only way she really knows how, which is going to make her acceptable, right? And so that's a good point. A really good point. Speaking of things to kind of get in with the other kids, we learn a little bit about, and I had forgotten about the whole mouse in the pocket thing when.
Yeah, that's the iconic thing. Well, one of the iconic things from this episode. Yeah.
I remembered that Anne gave a sort of impromptu birds and the bees discussion that was a little off. However, I had forgotten about the whole mouse analogy for an erection. I have no idea if that's really used to be used or said or anything, but, and then her having stories about the horrible household that she lived in before. And it backfires fairly obviously. I think, anyone who's had a normal school experience can look at that and say, oh, I can see where this is going. The really interesting thing to me was, thin veneer once again, is that the civilized and, socially adept, youths, all the girls were really when this was kind of exciting and sort of surface level titillating, it was like, ooh, tell me more. And then all of a sudden it was like, you know, too far.
Well, and I think that kind of, again, goes back to the whole, coning Anne with this bit of neurodivergent, viewpoint or perspective, is that there is often these moments, and I can at least speak to this from being, at sleepovers when I was a kid and, telling stories that I thought everyone was going to be engaged with. And then you finally say that one thing, and then everyone's like, what? Yeah. What did you say? Why did you think that's cool? That's gross. That's not cool, and I think you can read kind of the social beats of that moment to see that it's going to go in that direction the moment that she starts using words that they're not fully the innuendos that the characters are trying to say. And my favorite thing I noticed is in the midst of the conversation, there's kind of these highs and lows vocally of the actors where they're saying oh yeah, come on, we want to hear more about the conversation and the thing and everything. And then there's a moment where they're completely silent.
Yeah. And it's interesting because the two things I saw that really turned them off, one was Anne's description of overhearing sex.
Being
like, boy, sometimes they were laughing. It sounded fun. And then other times I thought, he's going to kill her. What is going on in there? And then,
or that she's going to kill him.
Or that she's going to kill. Yes.
Yeah.
And then the next day when she'd come after me with the wooden spoon, and they really kind of paled at that. And it reminded me, just like you're saying, there's these boundaries, these social boundaries that everybody thinks everybody has, right? Mm-hmm. But because of experience, and this is one of the things we see in the episode about Anne's ongoing struggles with really PTSD, if you will, is one of them.
Right.
And also having a sort of just institutionalization and those difficulties to where she can say, yeah, then she just beat my ass. And not in those words back then, obviously, but
yeah.
And then for her, it was wait, why is everybody being weird? I just was talking normally, right? About something that was, let's face it, normal for that situation that she was in.
And normal for her. Oh, yeah. And normal for her everyday life.
Yeah.
That. And again, that's something that I think another character in the show that Marilla has a conversation with later has no grasp of that because they come from a completely different social dynamic and world.
Oh, we're going to Yeah. I have a big couple notes about that. One thing that hits me as we're talking is that there's the reaction of the community at large, so to speak, the kids, their parents, that kind of thing, to this, because this conversation spirals out of control, gossipy wise. But Matthew, I thought that, so here's a very interesting reflection. Even Marilla is at first scandalized, oh my gosh, I can't believe she did this. Matthew's the only one whose initial reaction is, that poor kid. Mm-hmm. And I think he even says, there's someone who's not very expressive, but he says, it burns me up to think what has been done to her. Right.
Right. That he has this,
to these things.
Yeah, exactly. And he has this sense of compassion towards her immediately. And I think that really speaks to his internal, kind of fatherly, connection that he's making with Anne. Whereas Marilla is still struggling to have that motherly, immediately on Anne's side kind of bond by comparison.
And it's interesting that conversation is what spurs her onward to go and mother in a way.
Right.
We see her turn this corner where, first of all, gosh, there's so much in this episode where she turns this corner where it's like, I got to be there for my daughter. Right. That is my allegiance to this, even more than my community, my church, this weird group of people who invited me to their progressive dinner or whatever, and goes and stands up for her. Did you notice? I thought it was interesting that Marilla, in a way, is in a very, very similar situation and seems to have similar emotions to Anne. Like when she goes to the tea party or really anywhere in this episode she goes is out of her element, right?
Right. Well, I think consistently throughout the series, and again, this is a great episode to pinpoint this, that Marilla and Anne are both outsiders in their own communities. Marilla came from a life where she wasn't glamorous ever, that she wasn't held to some sort of idealized beauty standard. And instead, she was a hardworking woman and a father, a mother, a farmer, all those things, all in one person at a time where you had to be a very, idealized, feminized woman. And you couldn't necessarily be macho. You couldn't do all of these kind of girl bossy power things, right?
And we learn later mothering not only Matthew, but her own mother.
Right. And taking on so many roles and responsibilities that are not exactly the same as Anne, but are akin to the struggles that Anne has gone through. And I think one of the reasons why this adaptation overall, like throughout the whole series, is one of the best is because it mirrors Marilla and Anne's social experiences so poignantly and so well. And the one thing in particular with this that sticks out to me is that they mirror both Anne and Marilla's drive and desire to be amongst a familiar group of women.
Yes.
Because both characters throughout the show have decent connections with men, like Matthew, or I always forget his name, but the little boy that works at the stable.
Jock?
Jock, yeah. That, they have these relationships with men that are a lot more easily accessible because they aren't looking to fulfill the same sort of acceptance and popularity that they would get with female encounters and relationships, right? But in these moments where they finally get to interact with these large groups of, little girls or women, they have a hard time societally fitting into those boxes of acceptability.
Wow, that's a really good point, and I hadn't thought about that angle on it as much. As you're saying that, it reminds me there's a kind of just it's kind of an old school psychological principle, right? Is that you form a desire for support, acceptance, love with your parents, right? Whoever they are, whoever your caretakers are, hopefully, right? I mean, obviously, there's some exceptions to that in extreme, in negative situations, but ideally, you form an attachment to them. But the attachment you form with generally the same sex parent, for many people, is that desire for acceptance into that club. If my mom can accept me, I'm a woman. If my dad can accept me, then I'm a man, right? Because I can't compare myself to that group. And I'd say even it's still very strong, no matter how much we may, whatever we talk about gender roles. But now back then, it was really strong. Even to the point that when Anne does naturally have a tendency to befriend and be attractive, not just physically, but attractive emotionally and intellectually to Gilbert, and he wants to get to know her, she's like, I'm not allowed to because my peers, the girls here, have told me I'm not allowed to, and I need to be in that group. And right. Almost to the point where when you're watching, he's just trying to be nice, and he does save her from whatever that, was going to happen. But he may be trying to be nice, but there's a part of me watching it that's like, would you just leave her alone? You're just really screwing her up socially, man. Leave her alone.
Yeah. Well, the thing that stuck out to me in regards to that is in the entirety of Anne of Green Gables adaptations, we always get to see the relationship between Anne and Gilbert as being like kind of a haters to lovers, dynamic. But I think this, in my opinion, but granted, I haven't seen every single Anne of Green Gables. I've seen a lot of them. I think this is the first one where Gilbert genuinely feels this attraction to Anne that is so genuine and so sweet and so harmful and non-bullying at first, that it's really the more social kind of structure around the two of them that makes their relationship become fickle and then become something that, of course we love, as fans of this too,
Oh, even when he comes on screen, you're like, that's Gilbert.
It's Gilbert.
Gilbert's here. If you know the stories. So, and it's interesting too, because he's at the other end of the social spectrum. He's very popular. He comes from, I think, a well-to-do family, if I understand the dynamics of that correctly, or at least a well-established farm family. And so he's at this other the end of the social spectrum. But I think you get an idea of the kind of loneliness that he feels internally, right? He's got a deeper internal life. And this is the thing when you're mixing it up with same-age peers, I think as a kid, especially this awkward age of pre-adolescence to adolescence, where you start to learn that anything special or excellent is to be avoided, right? You should not stand out. You should, that's what's preached, even non-verbally. And I get one of the things I think there's a similarity between him and Anne is they're both dreamers, right? And that separates them from their peers in a way that they see beyond just I got to get so-and-so to like me, and I got to get the hay in, and I got to get, this is me. I don't mean to be reductive if anybody out there's get the hay in, I guess is what I shoe the horse. You see, I don't really know. So people who know things, you got one over on me. I get it, but you could just apply it, and you could apply it to an urban setting too, of just like, whatever surface level things we think about and are taught that is okay to think about. We don't have time to decorate our hats. In fact, what we need is for everyone to sadly pluck the flowers off after their first day of school because they've learned to be ashamed of their creativity, right?
Right. Well, and kind of what's I find ironic in regards to that whole bit is right after the whole hat interaction between her and Diana. I don't know if you caught it, but there's this whole kind of conversation about how plain Anne looks compared to the other girls, because they're like, why would you want to wear that ugly thing? And she's like, well, I'm just happy to have anything that's new. And they kind of make a point to say that, her clothes are old or, or out of step or, don't have any sort of like feminine vibrancy within them,
That's interesting. It reminds me a little of the thing I thought was interesting at the tea meeting with Marilla, which was a great line, by the way, when Rachel Lynde was like, you were at that, I don't even know what to call it. And she's like, meeting? It's a meeting. Anyway, but when she's... As
if like it was a witches and they were doing a seance or something.
Or when she says, did you all dance naked in the town square? And she's like, no, we ran out of time. But so I do like that about this version, the way that Marilla's played. But when she's at the tea meeting thingy, they take a dig, like indirectly a dig at like, especially those who have never married or those who have low prospect of marriage, which is a dig at her and Anne in a way. Not that you have to be married, but back then, right? That's the place that marriage holds is like, you should be ashamed that you never did, and that you're
right. Exactly.
So, and there's all this assumption where even before the controversy, and you see the lack of compassion. But even before that, you are noticing that the girls are telling her, oh, I should have said hi to you. My mom wouldn't let me. Oh, we should walk to school together. My parents wouldn't be happy about it, though. All this, they're already telling their kids not to be friends with her. At the same time, they're feeling like, here's this crown jewel for our little progressive group, right? Which is the woman, the single, older mother who adopted this orphan, and aren't we great for letting her in? Meanwhile, we're actively submarining her social needs, right?
Right. And, one of the things that I also thought was very fascinating about that whole dynamic of them being like, oh, let's let you into this group, is they made a point to say, and good for you for adopting a girl and not a boy, because again, that sort of, keys into the whole understanding of in this world that women are always lesser than, and that they are sort of like always going to be the less inspired, the less beloved thing in this society. And that on top of all that, Marilla just happened to adopt this girl that has been through so much trauma and so many things. And she has red hair and she has freckles and she likes to dream and she knows all these things about books. It's like she picked the most abstract and out there girl possible. And no matter how she would have presented how great of a person Anne is, these women in this community cannot seem to accept either of them regardless.
Yeah. And it's very interesting that the very same things that people are hating, even proactively hating, are some of the very same things that actually redeem Anne in their eyes. Let me say she doesn't need redemption in reality, but and we'll see that more in the next few upcoming episodes. One of the things I'm always fascinated by is the effect that she has around her. Think of when she comes in and when Rachel Lynde and Marilla are arguing about this progressive, weird, radical women's group, and they're arguing. They're getting pretty heated. As two people who have known each other for a long time sometimes can. She just comes in and says, oh, you two are so inspiring. You're such great friends, right? And she's so in awe of this acceptance and attachment that she's never really known, especially outside of her dreams and her aspirations. And they get chummy again. They warm up to each other after she leaves the room, like, okay, yeah, we were just yelling at each other, whatever, I'll talk to you later,
They do, but then at the same time, I don't know if you noticed also, Anne makes a comment. They ask her like, oh, how was school? And she very much brushes past the topic of what it actually was like. And I think she rather would hone in on the good relationship between Marilla and Rachel than really dive into how her social interactions are not what she dreams them to be, are not like the ones she sees in front of her that she wishes she could have in her life.
That's a really good point. Yeah, how she is coping. I think that we see her coping with the dreams, the imagination, what she thinks could be. Oh, tomorrow's a new day with no mistakes. And it's like, yeah, good luck with that. You've never been to school.
Yeah.
And then ultimately we also see the other coping skill that she uses at the end, which is to run. Right. When Mr. Teacher Man calls her up to humiliate her in front of the class. Admittedly, I mean, she did whack Gilbert in the face with a chalkboard. Although he grabbed her by the hair, right? And he even tried to say, I provoked her. It was my fault. And he's like, no, I'm going to punish her. She's a girl. She's an orphan. She's the one to get punished.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And I think that's something that we don't really talk enough about in the span of Anne of Green Gables adaptations, is how that scene and specifically between Gilbert and Anne is played out, and how generationally it's so different between every version. Because again, I think this is one of the only times where Gilbert actually says like, hey, it was my fault. Like, I'm the one, like, he's taking responsibility for it. And he also, I think, kind of clues into the fact that Anne is in a weird social situation that is outside of her realm. And I also want to add, just because I don't want to forget it, I love the moment when he's talking to the guys This is before the, school board slap scene. When he's talking to the guys and they're all like, oh, like, she's so weird and whatever. Like, why would you be what? Like, why would you want to walk with her? And he's like, well, she's cute. Like, why shouldn't I? Like, if she's a cute girl, she's a cute girl. Doesn't matter.
Yeah.
And again,
I don't care where she came from. Yeah.
Right. And again, I think having Gilbert have that genuine attraction to her right from the get-go, where we've had all these moments of her doubting her physical appearance, her saying she has red hair, she has freckles and all this stuff, is a very poignant thing for this adaptation to kind of spell out from the get-go.
It's interesting. I actually do like this version of Gilbert a little better than the old miniseries. And just because I feel like they have a real chemistry way earlier on. Like you said, it's almost immediate, even when she's trying to ignore him. And even when she smacks him, I mean, he seems to get right away. I think in the old version, he was mad, right? And it's like, well, no, you attacked her by grabbing her hair, dude. And then she hits him and says, I'm not talking to you. And then he just basically bounces back and he's like, well, you did, So he's teasing still. But you can tell he's not really turned off by the fact. And in a way, it's almost like he admires that, oh, yeah, I did that and you didn't put up with it,
Right.
You almost get the idea that he kind of is like, yeah, no, that's, I deserve that. So we do see that. And also, we are introduced by him coming to her aid when Prissy's brother was going to, hit her, kill her? I don't know what. There's, we can.
Oh my God, that scene. Oh, it freaks me out so much.
It's scary because you can feel the vulnerability, right?
Yeah. Well, and also, there's all these notions throughout the show that really connect to like modern day school interactions with kids. And that was among the many that are in this episode that really struck home with me of what kind of are the seeds culturally of bullying. And how, the whole notion of boys will be boys and how that's kind of been something that's acceptable, societally to other people, where nowadays we're like, oh my God, a young boy attacking like a young girl, even though he's doing it because he's supposedly under the guise of protecting his little sister and everything. Which, by the way, if he was protecting his little sister, why wasn't he standing up to the teacher in the first place?
Yeah.
Like, what's up with that?
Exactly. Well, and then the fear of, the thing that occurred to me watching this time is we don't really know what he was going to do. I mean, not to get real dark here, but, this is a series that is a little more dark, at least more grounded with the trauma and things. And was he going to hit her? Was he going to do worse? What are we talking here? And the thing that occurred to me too was it was 100% based off his feeling of freedom to do that was 100% based off of who she is. He wouldn't have done that to Diana because her family would have had his ass, right? I mean, basically he would be, if really almost, I don't know, any of the other girls to some extent, right? He'd be, he could be ostracized in a small community, or he could be, I mean, I don't mean to exaggerate the safety of the higher socioeconomic status women. I mean, because women are always targeted by dudes like that and all that. But I just mean that in a community like that, I'm guessing that those in the upper crust, he wouldn't have done that in the same way with the same recklessness or the same abandon. It's like,
he would be more.
No one's going to care. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And he would be more cautious.
Yeah.
I think than to immediately go into this, quite frankly, derogatory attack towards this girl that he has no idea who she is. Also, can we just talk about how immediately when he sees her before that scene, he calls her a dog?
Yeah.
Like, how absolutely disrespectful and terrible could you be as a boy? And I think what is so funny, kind of relating to that, is the character that they chose to say that is, by most definitions, the kid in the cast of the boys other than Gilbert that would be considered the most traditionally handsome.
Going
and I don't
out of
know
his way to attack, right?
Yeah, and I don't know if the casting directors and the creatives like purposely picked that to like juxtapose like this angelic looking like blonde-haired tall boy,
Interesting. Yeah.
to say that.
That's interesting. And it also, and I especially like it because it backs up my theory. No, because not to say that it's good just because it agrees with me, but it really does showcase that once again, that thin veneer of like, oh, everything's civilized. It reminds me in a way of reading Huck Finn. And a lot of people, I think, miss a little bit of the mark of that book, and they maybe don't understand. I don't know, not to be, oh, I do, but then I read a literary analysis of it once. That's where I get this from. So it's not like I thought of it, but Mark Twain's whole point in that it wasn't just an adventure story. It wasn't just simply about freeing an enslaved person, although that's heavily part of it. It was about the critique of society as is, the status quo, covering up evils, basically, is what he would look at it and say, and there's a part in there where Huck is trying to make up a story for the lady who cares for him or whatever to try to explain where he was and why he's late getting home. And he says that something on the riverboat, there's a boiler that exploded or something. I'm getting it, whatever, my memory. But she says like, well, I hope no one was hurt. And he says, no, only a couple of, and then he uses a euphemism for, black people, obviously, that is in that book. He says a couple, there were a couple of black people who were killed. And she says, well, thank goodness that no one was hurt. And that's showcasing, right? And then there's several parts in it too. It's showcasing like, hey, as long as everything's according to the plan, it's fine. But, once we break the rules, it doesn't matter if the rules are terrible or stupid or even evil, even if they're hiding evil, And so, to your point exactly of why not go after the teacher in all of this?
Right. Or go after the fact that there's all of this other girls in the school that aren't saying or doing anything about it. Now, granted, at that time, that socially made sense, but still, why aren't you attacking the teacher? Why aren't you standing up for your sister? If you're so willing to stand up for your sister, apparently against a little girl that you don't know at all, why wouldn't you do that to the teacher? Oh, you don't want to do it to the teacher because you want to be liked by the teacher and he's a man and whatever. But, it just, it shows how much of a chauvinist pig that character is. Absolutely. And I don't like him.
Yeah. So when Marilla is triggered into her empathy state, right? And I don't know that she wasn't, I'm not saying she didn't have empathy before because she's worried about the community. She's worried about Anne in a different way. But, when they're talking and they look at things from a standpoint of what has she been through? What has she been exposed to? That's when she sets out to Mrs. Prissy's mom. I didn't write down the last name, so I'm not sure what that is. But anyway, she goes up and comes in the spirit of offering the olive branch, right? She comes there to apologize, to say, hey, we can be cool, right? And no, we can't. According to this person, right? And I love the way that she lays into her. And she says that unfortunately in all of your ideals, compassion is not one of them. But I'm sure, how did she put it? I'm sure you'll muster up some for church on Sunday. So really slams this lady. You don't have any empathy. You don't have any compassion, essentially being leave my daughter alone. Right. You don't know what my kid's been through.
Yeah. Well, or just even if it wasn't her daughter, have the capacity to have a more open-mindedness as to the things that people have gone through that might have resulted in that behavior. It's really not that hard to do. But I think kind of related to that, it talks about how a lot of the women in that community are, very righteous and religious and that they want to be, upholding this social image, right? And much like we talk about, politically today with a lot of people that, are under the guise of, oh, it's for the children, it's for, Christianity, all this stuff, blah, blah, blah. It's really because societally they cannot think outside of their own box.
Right. And it's very interesting as I'll try to step into the shoes of this other woman, this other mother. Yeah, she's got a daughter too, and she also it's very interesting that for all the ideals, and I don't mean this as a critique necessarily, because we all live in the system we live in, right? But for all the ideals that she likes to espouse in her progressive group, she's really, really reacting to the social reality of the time, which is if people think that my daughter is having sex at all, let alone with the teacher in some scandal. I mean, she could have sex with a same-age peer and the scandal would land on her. And it's like, you're going to ruin my daughter in this community, right? And how much of it is, not to get too in the weeds here, but this is under the guise of being tutored, right? That he is teaching and preparing her with a recommendation for an education, which is this mom's dream. And on the plus side, not plus, but on the empathy side, I can see where she's worried about her daughter and her future in many ways. Now, on the other side, there is how much of this is my daughter's going to school and being educated because that's what I believe in. And that's all I'm looking at. Turning a blind eye to the reality of this terrible situation, because once again, crown jewel in my set. So I'm taking a shot at her, I guess, and having empathy for the character too. Trying.
And it's good to do that, because it's good to have a more, unlike the character, open-minded view as to the perspective that she's coming from. But yet again, I ask, if you're hearing rumors about that with your kid and them being with an adult, then maybe they're having an inappropriate sexual relationship with, why aren't you confronting the tutor/teacher? Yeah. Why is it being all thrown on Anne? And that kind of goes back to how, throughout the course of media, we always have the, Will Smith said it brilliantly, parents just don't understand, right? That they're never going to be on the side of kids. They're always going to be on the side of other adults. And I think that scene, jokes, what have you, really poignantly says that, because rather than getting mad at this adult man that may be having an inappropriate relationship with your child, you're pinning all that on a little girl who is just, speaking through what she heard through the grapevine and what she, vaguely saw, and is taking in her own life experiences and saying that out loud. And kids, and I'm sure you know this because you have kids, but kids are brutally honest a lot of the time. And if that's what she saw, that's what she saw. So,
and obviously there's some embellishment. We only see them like touch hands, I guess, is the only thing we actually see happen. But there's definitely at least an inappropriate emotional relationship going on, right? Mm-hmm. In the sound. And yeah, it just, one of the things that I had written down here too, I was going to mention is, we really see the Cuthbert's parent in this, right? Matthew, just look at Rachel's reaction when he shows up at her door alone without, it was not Marilla, it's him. And she's like, what the hell are you doing here? Kind of like.
I love in that scene when she's like, so what are you here for? And he's like, and like, he can't even like say like a full sentence. He just like blurts it out. She's like, okay, yeah, just come in.
And it's a weird sort of backhanded compliment that, I figured if there was scandal in the town, you'd already be neck deep into knowing what it is.
Yeah, she knows. She knows.
And, him confronting that, because when he goes and says, I'll have to miss lunch, I'm going to work. At first, you read that as he's being avoidant, like he often is, but he confronts that. And then we see Marilla confront her discomfort to go and essentially tell off, this woman. And then her other big parenting moment is when Anne runs from the school. Who does she want, right? Like, she wants her mom, essentially. She never had one before.
Right.
And now she does. And I think you see that she does in that moment where she just runs straight in and just wraps her arms around her. Marilla doesn't strike me as a hugger particularly. I don't know what what would have to happen before she'd initiate a hug, at least at this point in her evolution in the show, right? But she just runs in and just hugs her, and all they just have this moment, where
Yeah.
she's just there for her, and Matthew checking up on her too, but she's just there for her, and she just says, "I'm sorry. I know how you feel."
And that's because this episode, she literally knows how she
Yes, yeah.
feels. Like they literally went through the same social, BS, for lack of a better term.
Exactly.
Then,
that's a good, the parallel roads kind of intersect at this point, and it's like, yep, I get it, And in a way also because, once again, going back to that acceptance piece, she wants the acceptance of her peers, particularly same-sex peers, right, in a way. And who does she run to? In some ways at this point, we've seen Matthew be a bit warmer, right, in some ways, even though it's very quiet. But then to say, but I need my mom. I need Marilla to be there and to understand me, and that's where I'll be safe in this way.
right.
And so then you see them come together, and in that moment, you realize that they, as mother-daughter, and really as a family, right, they can do some things for each other, of this little sort of like heartbroken family, in a way, where they've all been kicked around by life, all three of them, in different ways, being there for each other in ways that nobody else really could.
Right. And that also they both know what it's like to be on the outskirts of society, and that they are two women who don't fit the mold of what other women in this community want to be. So of course they would be drawn to each other. And also because as there are little sprinkles in this episode, by the way, hinting that Anne would eventually, for a brief time, be homeschooled. Because not only is there a remark I think made during the luncheon that Marilla has with the, feminist group, but there also is a remark about when Matthew is talking to Jacques, right? The little kid. Yeah. And he says, like, "Oh, did you ever go to school?" He's like, "I did, but around your age, I decided, like, not to go anymore." There's little bits about how these three characters have never fit in with this community ever, and how they will continually not fit in throughout the course of the series.
And it's funny how Jock also is kind of this, not foil exactly, but, there's this little like oil and vinegar, whatever, this kind of thing with him and Anne, where she's a little standoffish, like, "I don't know you, leave me alone," Whereas in reality, they have a lot in common. He's not an orphan, but he is rejected in the town. His family's poor, and he can't even think about going to school because he's got to contribute to the expenses and things. And you'll see that change over time when they, but. Also, I think Anne sees him as a threat a little bit. I've got this brand new family. Don't come in here and who are you? What are you doing here? Kind of thing.
I love the moment when when she's talking to the horse, which, by the way, says so much that only socially she feels like she can connect with a horse than she can with anyone else. And she's like, "I hope we'll be friends forever," and everything, which I'm sure a lot of people that are listening to this can connect with, feeling like animals are kind of the only ones that understand us and not humans, Yeah. But I love that moment when she says to him, like, "Don't be eavesdropping on my conversation." And the entire episode, he's like, "What does this word mean?
What is this?"
And I think that scene is fantastic because it really speaks to how, they are similar. They both live in this outskirts kind of outsider world from their peers. And yet there's always this like friction of Anne feeling this superiority to him from a verbal and intellectual standpoint.
And really, it's interesting. I hadn't thought about it this way. Who else has she got to look down on?
Right.
Not to be, but like water runs downhill, right? I'm going to say water. I guess I could say something else, but all things run downhill if you think about it.
Indiana Jones boulders, carrots.
There you go. Yeah. School chalkboards, all kinds of things roll downhill. It's
they go down, but they also go across your face.
Yes. It's like you get to that dynamic of the oldest kid picks on the middle kid picks on the youngest kid picks on the dog, or whatever it is. It's like, who else is around I can boss around or something. So,
Right.
Not so bad. I didn't mean to make Jock the dog. That's a bad analogy for this, but you know what I mean. He's just in a place where he's accessible and she can be like, leave me alone.
Right.
So, well, this is, I'm excited to go on to the next one. We've got some one of the cool things about this is seeing, when you know the other iterations, is seeing their take on some of these things and how they show this. Anne is more awkward and is in this version, I think, than other versions in some ways too, as far as socially awkward and, I don't know. I mean, I really enjoy the other versions too, but there's a little bit, and I think it has to do with when it was made, right? Because you have a little of the Little Orphan Annie Pollyanna-ness where it's like, oh, wow, look at this kid who's awesome. Everyone hates them, and it's like, okay, they're just this bright ray of sunshine all the time. And yes, she is that, but at the same time, she's also, I don't know, this one just delivers in a way that it's like, I can see why people are put off by the way she is acting sometimes.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that relates, again, to the fact that she's coded to be, at least from my perspective, neurodivergent, because she definitely, goes to the beat of her own drum when it comes to her imagination and the way she looks at things in a much bigger, broader, fantastical way. And, one thing I meant to mention that kind of points into that even more so is the scene where they're reading the poems out loud in the classroom. And she just goes full theater kit. Like she goes like enunciation, taking breaths, focusing on this word and making it loud. And she is so excited to do that in front of people because she thinks like, this is it. This is my moment. This is when people are going to think that I'm cool. Yes. And I think that a lot of people that are, coming from that viewpoint, or even if you're not neurodivergent and you definitely have been in social situations as a kid, you want to find that niche thing that you're good at, that you want people to finally be like, oh, they're so cool because they did the thing, Yes. And she thinks that she's the coolest person ever for finally reading that poem. And instead people are like, oh, that was weird, and I think that version of that scene could have only come out of this time period in which it was made, because the ideals of kids being cringe and that kind of consciousness socially, I think could have only happened now. And that's why I love this version.
That's a very good point too, because you have the dichotomy of like the modern storytelling that we have now. And also at the time, it was interesting that after she does that, Gilbert's like, well, that was good. And there was that, I mean, you remember her in the train station, right? She was selling that experience to people, and there was an element of that. I just rewatched Little Women the other day, and they're at older age than maybe you would usually now, putting on plays and doing things with a lot of pretend and a lot of things like that were, because it was like, they didn't have Netflix. They couldn't watch Anne with an E back then. So they had to do whatever they had to do. So
it's true. And in the case of that, they had to pretend that they were men in a lot of those instances because they couldn't have an imagination as a woman, God forbid, because look at what's happening to Anne.
Exactly. And I think one of the defining things of Anne that is a little more nuanced than the old school, hey, she's chipper no matter what. It's like, well, no, she's not chipper no matter what in this version. But one thing is that she does have an anchor in her, what you might call her core self, her own essence of who she is. She doesn't give up on, she might pluck the flowers embarrassedly, if that's a word, from her hat, right, and throw them on the ground. But she's going to put more flowers somewhere. I mean, it's like, she is. That part of her can't be killed. And I think that is different than most of us at least go through a period, and many people go through maybe their whole lives, where it's like, well, I got to kill that part and just ignore it forever and never bring it back, right? And at the very least, we all go through those times where we're taught to be ashamed of being creative and clever and innovative and loud and whatever it is that we are, right? It's like,
yeah, and
stop
God
it.
forbid and God forbid being theatrical and excited and passionate about things because, oh no, that's so cringe. You can't be excited about your interests, you know?
Right. Yeah. So, where's the cynicism? Gosh.
Right. Oh, also, before we end the episode, I wanted to give a special shout out to the music in this episode because I think the score throughout the series is amazing. And it's by, and I'm going to mispronounce their names, Amin Batia and Ari Posner. I believe they're Canadian composers, but they did an incredible job in this episode. In particular, the scene where Anne runs from the school. I think that combined with the actions that take place really hone in on the emotional arc of Anne in this episode and is kind of like the cherry on the sundae of what makes this episode a standout one throughout the series.
Really good point. Yeah, really good. I agree. That's really cool. Yeah. And I hadn't noticed it to that extent, but when you mention that scene, it's like, oh yeah, right. Because yeah, I also like how they do the sound where they fade out the dialogue and you hear from Anne's perspective. And anybody who's had experience with having an anxiety attack or a trauma flashback or anything is like, yeah, I'm not actually here right now. Right.
Right. You're disassociating.
Yeah, exactly. So, well, we'll tune in again, of course, for the future, but tell people a little bit, where do they find you? What are you up to these days? Is there anything that people should clue in and follow online or in, your exciting stuff you're doing?
Yeah. So right now I have joined the magical world of Threads, which is a new app. So
I haven't yet. How is it?
It's good. It needs a little fine tuning. I don't love that there's not really a search engine for topics. You only can search for people right now, which is a little strange. But, other than that, I'm digging it. But on there and also on the one with the bird and also the one with the camera icon, I'm at It's Really Dalin with 2 E's. Like Anne, she has an E. I have 2 E's in my screen. But yeah, It's Really Dalin. And yeah, I'm doing that. And also I'm focusing on trying to do my own podcasts and kind of finally getting my own reviews and stuff up on my own little website. So look out for that soon.
Very cool. Very cool. We will keep people updated as we go forward with our fan with an EN analysis.
I love it.
Thank you for listening to the Court and Parts Podcast Network. To listen to more Court and Parts shows, visit courtandarts.com.